Hey there. Ready to dive into some serious brain food? Today, we're tackling how philosophers in the Middle Ages, yep, Knights and Castles era, tried to figure out how our thoughts actually, represent the world.
It's really amazing how these ideas from so long ago still connect with how we talk about consciousness and how we see reality today.
I know, right? Get ready to explore some pretty wild theories about mental images and languages of thought. Oh, and even how a donkey named Brunellus
Yeah.
can help us understand how words connect to actual things.
It all starts with this idea of mental representation, right? It's like the idea that our thoughts are actually about something. They have content, they refer to things out there in the world.
Okay, so it's how our thoughts, how they connect to reality.
Exactly, or even to things that don't exist, like unicorns.
Right, right, our imaginations.
Yeah, and for medieval thinkers, this was a huge deal
I bet.
because they were trying to understand how our minds, our souls, which they thought of as immaterial, could interact with and understand the material world.
It's like, how can something invisible grasp something physical?
Exactly, and this aboutness of thought, that's what we call intentionality.
Ah,
A
intentionality.
key concept in philosophy of mind, the directedness of our thoughts towards something.
Gotcha. So, trying to solve the mind-body problem way before it even had that name.
You got it, and a big influence on their thinking was Aristotle, of course.
Aristotle, good old Aristotle.
His theory of sameness of form was a major starting point, and the idea is basically that when you think about something, your mind kind of takes on the form of that thing.
Wait, so if I'm thinking about, let's say, a daffodil,
Okay.
does that mean my mind turns into a daffodil?
Not literally, no.
Okay, good.
It's more like your mind creates a mental image. They called it an intelligible species that shares the form of the daffodil, but in a spiritual, non-material way.
So it's not a physical change, more like an abstract kind of mirroring.
Exactly.
But hold on, if my mind is taking on the form of the daffodil, how's that different from the actual daffodil having that form?
That's a great question, and that's where Thomas Aquinas comes in.
Aquinas.
He argued that while the form of the daffodil is, really present in the actual flower, it's only spiritually present in our minds.
So different ways of being, even though the form itself is similar?
Right, but not everyone agreed with this whole sameness of form idea.
Makes sense.
Peter Oliphant, another big thinker, had some serious objections.
Oh,
His main critique was, if there's this mental image, a species, between my mind and the object, how do I know I'm actually grasping the object itself?
yeah, could I be stuck just thinking about the mental image, not the real thing?
Exactly, like mistaking the map for the territory.
Right, getting lost in the representation and missing the real thing.
And this gets into the problem of skepticism,
Oh yeah,
a
skepticism.
big one for philosophers.
How can we be sure we're knowing the world and not just our own internal representations?
Olivier saw these species as potentially creating a barrier between us and the world, opening the door to all sorts of skeptical worries.
So we've got Aquinas trying to refine Aristotle, and Olivier raising questions about how mental images connect us to reality.
Yeah, that's a good summary.
Where do we go from here?
Things get even more interesting from here, actually. As these debates about mental representation were going on, another fascinating thread pops up, and you might be surprised to hear it came from theology.
Theology.
Huh.
Really, I wouldn't have guessed that. How did theologians get mixed up in all this philosophy?
Well, back in the Middle Ages, philosophy and theology were super connected. Thinkers would often draw inspiration from both.
Makes sense.
So this theologian named Henry of Ghent,
Henry of Ghent.
he was wrestling with the nature of divine ideas, how God knows all possible things.
Okay.
And he said that these divine ideas, they're separate from God's essence, like blueprints for creation.
So even God has a system of representation, like divine mental blueprints.
That's a great way to put it.
But how does that connect to human minds?
That's the really insightful part. Henry's idea, this distinction between the representation and the thing being represented,
Right.
it led to a new way of thinking about the content of our thoughts.
So instead of just looking at mental images as a whole, they started to break them down, figure out how they're put together.
Exactly. They started to see this difference between the vehicle of representation, the mental act itself, and the content, what that act is about.
So if we're looking at a painting, the mental act is the canvas and the paint, and the content is the image those materials represent.
Precisely.
This is getting pretty meta.
And this distinction really takes off with John Donne's Scotus.
Scotus.
He argues that the mental act, the vehicle, it's just an accident of the mind, temporary, like a wave on the ocean.
Okay, so the thought itself is fleeting, but what about the content, the object being represented? Does that stick around in the mind?
For Scotus, the content has objective being in the mind. It's not really there in the same way a physical object is, but it exists as represented.
Wait a minute, this sounds a lot like Brentano's concept of intentionality.
Yeah.
Scotus was way ahead of his time.
It really shows how these medieval philosophers were wrestling with ideas that are still so important to philosophy of mind today, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
But it leaves us with this really interesting question. What kind of being do these thought objects have?
They're not real in the usual sense, but they're not nothing either.
It's like they exist in this weird in-between space.
Mental phantoms.
Exactly.
But let's move on from Scotus for now. Who else was making waves in this medieval sea of mental representation?
Well, you can't talk about this without mentioning William of Ockham.
Ockham, okay.
He came at it from a totally different angle, focusing on the idea of a mental language.
Mental language.
Right.
Like some secret code our minds use to represent the world? That's fascinating.
Yeah, Occam's theory was that our concepts, they're like words in our minds.
Okay.
They're caused by and represent things out there in the world, like a kind of internal dictionary.
So every time I see a cat, my mind comes up with this little mental word for cat.
Exactly. And these mental words are formed through what he called intuitive cognition, direct experience of things.
So when I see that cat, hear a bird singing small fresh bread,
That's it?
I'm forming concepts through this direct contact with the world.
Right. Like our minds are constantly taking notes, building up this vocabulary of experience.
And then we use these mental words to build more complex thoughts, like sentences.
That was Occam's idea. We combine these simple concepts, these mental words, into more complicated structures, just like we do with spoken language.
So our thoughts are like internal monologues, maybe even with their own grammar.
It's a really cool way to think about how our minds organize information.
It is. So did anyone else pick up this thread? Did this concept of mental language go any further?
It sure did. Our last stop takes us to John Buridan.
Buridan, all right?
And get this, it involves a donkey.
A donkey. Okay, now you've got me hooked. Tell me more.
John Buridan, he was a philosopher in the 14th century, and he really dug into this idea of mental language, especially how we form singular concepts.
Singular concepts.
You know, those that refer to specific individual things.
Okay, so not just donkey, but that specific donkey over there.
Exactly.
All right, I'm following.
So he said there are two types of singular concepts. Vague and determinate.
Vague and determinate. Okay.
Vague concepts come from our initial perception. Like, imagine you see a donkey in the distance.
Yeah.
At first, you're just like, what's that thing over there?
Right, it's blurry. I don't know what it is yet.
As you get closer, you get more info. You see it's a body, then an animal, then a donkey.
Gotcha.
And finally, you recognize it as your old pal Brunellus, the donkey with the messed up ear.
Brunellus, haha, we're getting to know this donkey pretty well.
So Buridan's saying we build up these determinate concepts from those initial vague impressions.
So our minds are like running these identification algorithms, refining our concepts as we get more data.
That's a great way to think about it.
But what about concepts for things we haven't actually experienced? Like, I've never met Socrates, but I still have a concept of him.
Right, and Buridan knew about this difference. He said there's a distinction between concepts from direct experience, like your Brunellus, and those from descriptions, like your Socrates.
So Brunellus is based on my own experience, but Socrates is more like secondhand info.
Exactly.
Does this connect to any modern philosophical ideas? It feels like it relates to where meaning comes from.
You're spot on, actually. This actually foreshadows the whole debate between internalist and externalist theories of meaning.
Wow.
Buridan's view, it's similar to internalism, which says the meaning of a concept is determined by stuff in the mind, not just its connection to the outside world.
So this medieval donkey is actually helping us understand some pretty deep philosophical issues about the nature of meaning itself. This is amazing.
And that's what makes it so fun to explore. We've gone from Aquinas' spiritual forms to Occam's mental language, and now Buridan's donkey.
It's been quite a journey.
I'm curious, what stands out to you so far? What's got your philosophical wheels turning?
You know, it really gets me. It's like they were wrestling with these huge questions about the mind without all the tools we have today.
Right.
No brain scans, no fancy labs, just like pure thought and debate.
Yeah.
Makes their ideas even more impressive, doesn't it?
Absolutely. They were real pioneers, like laying the foundation for everything that came after in philosophy of mind.
So as a philosopher, what do you think are the biggest takeaways from all this? Why should we, centuries later, still care about what these medieval guys thought?
I think one thing is that it gives us this really unique view into the history of philosophy.
Okay.
We can see how these key concepts and debates developed over time, things that are still shaping how we understand the mind today.
Right.
Like how we form concepts, the connection between language and thought, even the possibility of knowledge itself. It's like looking into the intellectual DNA of philosophy.
It's amazing how they were already talking about stuff
Yeah.
that cognitive science is just now starting to figure out with all these new methods.
I know, it's really cool. And even though their methods were different, their insights are still so valuable.
For
Like, take Scotus's idea of objective being.
Yeah.
It highlights the special way that mental content exists, even though it's not physically real in the same way as a table or a chair.
It's like it makes you rethink what it even means for something to be.
Exactly.
And it seems like so many of these medieval thinkers that we're really focused on how our minds connect to the world, how we bridge that gap between what's inside our heads and what's out there.
Definitely. And their theories give us all these different perspectives on that problem.
Like Aquinas saying our minds take on the forms of things, and then Olivier worrying about those mental images getting in the way of actually knowing reality.
It really forces you to think about how perception works, what knowledge is, and whether we can ever get things right.
It's interesting how these questions about mental representation tie into those bigger questions about how we know anything at all.
Right, it's all connected.
Like, if our concepts are shaped by our minds, like Burden said, how can we be sure we're actually understanding the world as it is?
That's a huge question, and it's one that philosophers are still debating today.
And these medieval guys, they give us all these different ideas to work with as we try to figure it out.
Yeah, so it's not just about history.
It's about, like, finding new ways to approach these big philosophical puzzles.
Exactly.
Seeing them from different angles, maybe even coming up with some fresh insights.
It reminds us that philosophy is this ongoing conversation.
And that talking to these thinkers from the past can help us understand things better today.
So, for our listener out there, the philosopher tuning in,
Yeah.
here's something to think about. We've seen how these medieval thinkers explored the nature of mental representation, from mirroring forms to the complexities of mental language.
Right.
But they were also wrestling with this even deeper question.
Okay.
What's the relationship between our thoughts and the world? How much do our minds actually shape what we see and what we know? Do we, like Kant said later on, impose these categories and structures onto the world? Or can we actually access reality as it truly is?
That's a big one.
It's a question without easy answers, but these medieval philosophers, they give us a great place to start.
They do. So keep questioning, keep thinking, and keep that philosophical spirit alive.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.